The National Guard serves a truly unique mission in this country. Joining us to help understand that mission a bit better is former Congressman, U.S. Army veteran, and author of the book, The Spirit of Philadelphia, Dr. Chris Gibson. Welcome, Dr. Gibson.
Hey, Congressman, good morning. Good to be with you.
Now, your book credits the success of America with the founders successfully balancing personal liberty with societal order. And how does all that fit into the National Guard narrative in our country?
Yeah, so an animating principle right at the beginning of our country was this idea of separation of powers, checking power. Of course, we learned that in school about the executive, legislative, judicial branches, but they actually carried it over to what was then the militia as well. So this is the idea of balancing power between the national government and the state governments. And so with the militia, they actually provided for the Congress to bring forward uniformity of laws and regulations so that if they were ever called into active duty, they would be ready to perform at a high level. And then command actually was shared. It was mostly at the governor level, unless the militia, now the National Guard, was federalized, and then the president would command it. So, you know, when you look at that and you look at the dual mission of the National Guard, it has a federal dimension, and that is to augment the active forces, whether it be for homeland defense, overseas deployments, or disasters, either natural or man-made. This is something that is put in the U.S. Code, Title 10, for federalization. Otherwise, it's Title 32 of the U.S. Code, and it's state-controlled. State governors have used the Guard for also disasters, both man-made and natural, including quelling unrest and sometimes issues in prisons. So, you know, this is supporting that animating principle at the founding of checking power.
So yeah, trying to understand the tension between the state control and the federal control, and in particular the president's control over the National Guard, is difficult for most Americans to understand. So could you tease that out for us a little bit more?
Yeah, so actually the militia dates back to 1636, so it's even older than the National Guard itself. But you know, here what's happening is that there is the provision for states to have a force. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have the Second Amendment, is the idea that we're going to have regulated militias. So we want citizens to be able to participate. Of course, nowadays, our government provides those arms. But, you know, so the governor has a force that can actually deal with any kind of issue inside the state. But also there was a need because they wanted to keep the regular army, and they wanted to keep the professional military force small because they were concerned about civilian control of the military. So, you know, your active forces were only just several regiments. You had the old guard at the Capitol, and, you know, a few regiments out on the frontier to deal with the Native American issues and concerns. But otherwise, you know, a small standing force. So there had to be provisions there to bring these militias onto active duty. And so we have them, and over time that's been backed up by court decision, U.S. Supreme Court.
So then came the Posse Comitatus Act after the Civil War, and most Americans look at that, and on its face it says you can't use the National Guard for law enforcement. Well, as clear as it may seem, there's a lot of exceptions. Can you kind of set those out for us?
Yeah, so, you know, as far as the history of the Posse Comitatus Act, it really comes about because presidents were really pushing the limits of what federal troops, or I should say militia troops, that then got federalized, what they were doing. President Grant actually federalized militias and suppressed, put down the KKK, successful at that. And then thereafter, presidents in both political parties used the office of the presidency to federalize militias to break up and resolve labor disputes. So there was some concern among the people's representatives in Congress in 1883 that they needed to put some limits, some guardrails against potential abuse of federalizing National Guard. So that's that Posse Comitatus Act. And so it does explicitly state that these federalized troops are not to be used for law enforcement activities. However, as you point out, there are exceptions to that. And, you know, we saw that in 1965 when LBJ was in a dispute with the governor of Alabama on how to deal with the Selma March. And so Governor Wallace was insistent that his force was under his control and they would, be stopping this march. And Johnson said no. He federalized the National Guard against the wishes of the governor. And so, he has that authority because he invoked that authority that the President of the United States shall enforce the laws of the nation. This is both the Civil Rights Act of '64, but also the court decisions that had been handed down earlier, including Topeka versus the Board of Education. He was not alone on this, by the way. President Eisenhower also invoked the same authority. So you have that authority under enforcing the laws, but then there's also this law called the Insurrection Act. And that also provides a carve out against the Posse Comitatus Act, too, that allows the president to use federalized National Guard, even including in law enforcement activities.
So now you have the president calling out and implementing the National Guard in D.C., but also doing it in California, which was temporarily at least struck down by the court. And he's intending to do it elsewhere. So let's try and look at the tension between those three. First, let's start with D.C. How is D.C. different than other states as far as implementing the Guard goes?
Well, in fact, it is different. And this comes right from the early days, including in the Constitution and early law that backed that up, and court cases the same. And this was this idea that we're going to have a geographic space in America where we would have our national capital. We ultimately land in the area of Georgetown. It was actually a swamp before we moved there. And so the founders really wanted to make sure that the Congress, the people's representatives, and the president had extraordinary powers for this national capital. And so that is provided for. So even what President Trump is doing today, there's wide agreement that he has that authority. Now, in law, it's 30 days that he can actually federalize the D.C. police. So there are some limits there, but he's in line with both Constitution and law. States are different. The expectation is that the president shall work with the governor. It's generally so that presidents don't deploy federalized National Guard troops against the wishes of the governor. But there are exceptions. And I mentioned to you one just moments ago with President Johnson. He actually had an exception, and that was to enforce law. President Trump is claiming protective principle. That's another exception to Posse Comitatus. He's claiming he has this authority because the president is charged with protecting federal property and federal officers in the line of duty. So as you mentioned, a lower court has actually struck that down, and this hasn't been stress tested against the Supreme Court, but it will be very soon. Scholars are somewhat split on this, but the majority thinking that protective principle is probably a reasonable judgment. We'll have to wait and see on that. But of course, that's not law enforcement activity so much. It is protection of federal property and federal officials in the line of duty.
Right. So there's differences between D.C. and other states, and also when you implement them in other states, even if you take the protective posture, just protecting federal interests, that's different than putting them in, kicking in doors with local law enforcement to go after bad guys. So that is all part of the concern as well. We only have a few minutes left, or a few seconds left, and obviously, I just want to make sure we understand this. There's no clear standard based on what you've said, and there's a lot of loopholes and exceptions that can be exploited by both sides. Is that fair to say?
Well, this is a lot of our scholars today believe that Congress needs to step in because, there are some court cases that are relevant here. 1827, there's a key court decision, the Martin decision, that actually gives the president authority to declare emergencies and then invoke the Insurrection Act. And then there's the 1932 clarification. This is a Sterling decision. And what happens here is they say, yes, but the president has to act in good faith. And these are reviewable. So, but still, that provides a lot of ambiguity. You notice that President Trump recently has been pivoting and talking more about Louisiana. Expectation there is the governor is going to be very supportive. So, that is different. We would probably move to a head in Chicago because the Illinois governor has at least said that he doesn't want those troops. So one of the ways that President Trump can avoid that potential conflict is to go to a state that the governor is asking for help. So, but in the absence of this, to your point, I do think that the Congress needs to step in and legislate to provide for more clarity.
Dr. Gibson, thank you so much for a really educational conversation. And again, Dr. Gibson's book, The Spirit of Philadelphia, is available now, and I highly recommend it.